Hi, today I want to talk to you about a qualitative exploration that I did on the Venezuelan social clash. I also want to talk about some of the economic relevance to this study and how it affected socially. So in this qualitative study, I'm going to aim to provide an explanation to the current economic, social, and political situation in Venezuela by introducing Venezuela as a nation that actually led to a social catastrophe. So let's start. Venezuela is a sovereign state that is considered a federal presidential republic. It's located in South America. It is bordered by Colombia to the west, Brazil to the south, Guyana to the east, and the Caribbean Sea to the north. I'm originally from the north of the country, which is by the Caribbean Sea. So I was raised in a coast town. Venezuela is one of the major oil exporters in the world and a member of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which makes the Venezuelan economy highly dependent on oil exports, which we know nowadays that is a very volatile environment. Venezuela is currently living under an anti-neoliberal government, which I actually like to call a post-neoliberal government, that have caused demise in the population and economic crisis of historical proportions. In order to explain what anti-neoliberal government is, we must first define neoliberalism. So, neoliberalism is contemporarily used to refer to market-oriented reform policies such as eliminating price controls, regulating capital markets, lowering trade barriers, and reducing state influence in the economy, especially through privatization and austerity. So what happens in this type of government, in neoliberalism, is that the government does not control anything. It lets the free hand of the market, or the invisible hand of the market, control everything, from prices to absolutely all the needs of the population. Let's talk about a little bit of history. So in the 1970s, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America and one of the 20th richest in the world. So what happened? This situation was due to the Yom Kippur War and the Middle East embargo, which increased oil revenues in the country, allowing of a 26% increase in the spending capacity of the government. By 1980s, a weakness in the oil market brought Venezuela's fast development to a halt. The demise of the Venezuelan economy was due to the easy revenues and yet the unpredictable income streams to the government arcs. The distorted macroeconomic policy brought with it corruption and clientelism. Also, the public health system saw an increase of hospital beds in the major urban centers, while those in the rural areas were marginalized. At this time, the main political party in the country, Acción Democrática, rationalized social spending programs amid pressure from affiliated unions and pro-market neoliberals who sought decentralization of the Venezuelan political system. Basically, Venezuela was in a centralized political system where the government controlled absolutely everything from the center. So from Caracas, everything was controlled, including the election or appointing governors and mayors in each city. By 1989, 54% of the Venezuelan population was living in extreme or critical poverty and without access to basic medical services. By the 1990s, the per capita fiscal oil revenue had fallen by one-third, and the acquired international debt climbed to 74% of the GDP. So Venezuela was in a high decline of their economy, and there was a social austerity coming up. During the 1980s and 1990s, the public health system in Venezuela became a center for corruption, while tax contributions to the welfare system saw a decline. So by 1992, Hugo Chavez, who was a new leader that had joined the Bolivarian circles, that he had formed in the movement of Fifth Republic, or how he called it, the Movimiento Quinta República, was basically a system with the rest of the military to overthrow the democratic government. This coup d'état that was failed, and he came out in on TV saying that for now, all the all the goals that he had proposed to for that day had failed. That was in February 1992. Everybody in the country remembers that. In 1998, the economy was still stagnating, and inequality between the well-off and those in marginalized situations was increasing. Chavez was clever in utilizing the discontent of his political campaign, the use of discourse on inequality, exclusion, poverty and corruption was a key tool to engage struggling voters, Chavez utilized a discourse of anti-neoliberal sentiments. In 1999, Chavez proposed a new constitution which increased social rights for its citizens and sought to decrease social inequality. So, as we know, he won the elections in 1999. He was he was put in power. He changed the constitution, and then moving forward, he started changing everything in the country that we thought was for the best. So, what is the methods for this study? This is an explanatory qualitative study which uses individual interviews and historical accounts in order to draw conclusions on the current situation in Venezuela. We conducted interviews with three class levels, so low class, middle class, and middle high class, to support the literature review on the historical accounts that led to the Venezuelan crisis. What were the results of this study? In 2003, the Chavez government created a healthcare initiative, Misión Barrio Adentro. There were several missions that brought healthcare to those in need. In a parallel investment, over 40 small missions, including education, job creation, food sovereignty, and health, were created. As you can read, over the education programs, the job creation programs, and the food sovereign programs called at the time. In the year 2012, Chavez was diagnosed with cancer, and although he was offered treatment by Brazilians and US doctors, he sought treatment in Cuba, as he had built a close relationship with the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. Before he died, obviously he appointed Nicolas Maduro as his successor in the 21st century socialism revolution. Amid government secrecy, Chavez was officially pronounced dead on March 5, 2013, even though the majority of the country believes that he died late December. The elections were then held, and President Nicolas Maduro was elected over the opposition candidate Enrique Capriles Radonsky. Due to the recession in oil prices in 2014, the country was left to deal with a massive debt and the oil revenue on which the popularity of Chavez hung. Then, consequently, the loans taken out during the oil boom still needed to be paid. Maduro also dismissed the advice of economic experts in the political spectrum because of his extremist leftist ideology. Maduro also ignored inflation warnings and decided to follow Cuban advice, following Marxist advisors. As you can see from one of our main responders, she says, with Nicolas Maduro, once Chavez dies, he does not know how to maintain the system of programs, because to maintain that system of programs, he needed more money, and the high corruption started. Since the corruption was high, he, Nicolas Maduro, could not sustain the social programs. The social programs started to diminish, and the crisis was far worse. So the social programs were a good thing for the country, were a good thing because they brought the need, what was needed by the poor people who supported the, Hugo Chavez. However, as we can see from this picture, Hugo Chavez became an idol. It became like a saint. It became to something the poor people idolized. They didn't have the brains or the educational capacity to think otherwise. Chavez came into TV every day for almost 12 hours on a wide broadcast, and people watch it regularly. So Chavez knew how to manipulate people, and he knew how to manipulate those in the most need. False. For the discussion, I wanna introduce a theory, which is false consciousness. And this is basically denotes people's inability to recognize inequality, oppression, and exploitation in a capitalist society because of the prevalence within it of views that naturalize and legitimize existence of social classes. In Venezuela during the 1980s and 1990s, the forgotten population did not possess social programs to sustain their basic needs. For this reason, the support of the Chavez social government was very successful among the poorest communities. However, the political system used by the government was mostly a social control program to create docile bodies. As I said, it was mostly a control situation from Chavez to the most marginalized. And as you can see from this picture on the right, this is where people live. Most of the people live in really dire conditions. For those of you who know about the east side in Vancouver, this is nothing like the east side of Vancouver. This is far worse. These people make their own houses from whatever they can find. Many Venezuelans believe nowadays that military intervention is a feasible solution to the current socio-political situation, however risky. Venezuelans have constantly protested the injustice of government, but to no avail. The country is divided, and global policies against the dictatorship seems to have little effect on towards the regime. So I believe the Venezuelan situation is unique in the world, and the country have been divided by an ideology. Those who support the regime have sworn to protect it with force, so weapons, while those against it have been resigned to work for a better country or flee in search of opportunities. In the neoliberal society of the 1980s and 1990s in Venezuela, marginalized populations were forgotten, and only those in the middle class societies benefited from this form of government. However, in the Chavez era, some of the social programs were effective in implementing healthcare, education, food security, etc. A future scenario would be on where both populations can be benefited equally, and where producers are incentivized to increase economic welfare for all. However, as we remember, just because Chavez implemented the social programs, just because Maduro wanted to help the poor, didn't actually mean that these people were intended to do so. They were intended to fill their pockets with money, and bring their friends along with it, and then let the poor be controlled by social programs that kept them busy, that gave them the basic needs they needed, even though they were in bad quality. Some of the food they're given uh, it's already past the due date, so it's not good for consumption. However, the government keeps giving them that type of food. My conclusion for this is: give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. If you have any questions or comments, please comment on the section below. I will be checking regularly and see if there's any comments, and I will answer to my earliest availability. Thank you.